Welcome, brave souls. Today, we journey into the heart of Myanmar's most chilling myths and legends. From vengeful spirits to haunting tales that have terrified generations, these stories are not for the faint of heart. So dim the lights, and let's uncover 7 of the scariest urban legends and folklore from Myanmar that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. Are you ready? Let's begin. The Mimics Village. In the early 1980s, when the streets of Pakoku still echoed with the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the villages along the riverbanks were tightly knit with ancient stories, my grandfather, U Tin, was in his 20s and full of the adventurous spirit that defined his youth. A man who had seen many corners of the world but still found comfort in the winding roads of his home, he always had a story to share. Stories of the real and the unreal, as if the two had blended together over the years. But there was one story that lingered in the back of his mind, a strange memory that he told me more than once when I was a child. It was a story of a village that wasn't quite a village, of a festival that wasn't quite a celebration, and of a night that never truly ended. It happened during a trip from Pakoku to Manyan. The journey was long, and the road twisted through dry, brushy fields, interrupted by the occasional grove of palm trees or a dusty marketplace. It was around dusk when my grandfather first noticed the faint glimmer of lights in the distance, a flickering like candles or torches, casting long shadows on the darkening road. He was traveling with a driver who knew the area well, but the sight of those distant lights made U Tin curious. "Stop here," he told the driver. "I know a shortcut through a village near this place. It's not far, I'll walk the rest of the way." The driver, an older man with a grizzled face, glanced at the lights but didn't question U Tin. He slowed the cart and let him go, continuing on his way to Manyin. U Tin walked toward the lights, the sounds of the road fading behind him as the warmth of the evening filled the air. He walked for some time, and as he drew closer, he saw a large clearing ahead, where people were gathered. It was a village, or at least it seemed like one, though he didn't recognize it. It was as if a festival had sprung up from nowhere. Lanterns hung from trees, casting soft glows on the faces of villagers laughing and chatting. Food stalls filled with the smells of sizzling meats and freshly baked bread, bonfires crackling, their flames dancing in the night. The air was filled with warmth and life, and U Tin couldn't resist the pull of it all. He stepped forward, mingling with the crowd, feeling lighter than he had in days. He found a seat by a food stall and ate, talking with the villagers as if he had known them all his life. There was a girl there, a young woman with a bright smile and an easy laugh. Her eyes twinkled in the firelight, and before he knew it, they were talking like old friends. They spoke of simple things, life in the village, the harvest, the beauty of the surrounding land. As the night deepened, they wandered around the festival together, hand in hand, until exhaustion caught up with him. And so my grandfather fell asleep, curled up by the warmth of a bonfire, a plate of food still beside him. When he awoke, it was still dark, but the village had disappeared. The food stalls were gone, the fires were out, the laughter had faded into silence. There was nothing there at all, just an empty, barren field stretching endlessly before him. He blinked in disbelief, rubbing his eyes. He stood up, checking around him for any sign that the village had just shifted or moved, that the lights had gone out but the people were still there. But no, there was nothing, not a single footprint, no trace of the festivities or the people who had been so lively just hours before. Confused and unsettled, U Tin began walking toward the highway. He tried to remember the path, but everything seemed unfamiliar now. Had he wandered off track? Had he slept longer than he thought? Eventually, he reached the main road again and flagged down a horseman, an old man with a weathered face, who was riding along the path. My grandfather asked him, casually, if he had ever heard of a festival or a village nearby. The horseman's reaction was immediate and chilling. His face drained of color, his eyes wide with terror. He grabbed U Tin's arm, pulling him away from the road, urging him to stop. "Don't talk about that village," the man whispered harshly. You need to get rid of it. Now." Yu-tin was stunned, unsure of what the horseman meant, but the man's frantic energy made him uneasy. "What do you mean? What village? What's wrong?" my grandfather asked, confused. The old man stared at him, his lips trembling. "You were in the mimic's village," he said in a hoarse voice. "That's where the spirits live. They—" Before the horseman could finish, he reached up and grabbed Yu-tin's hand, forcing his fingers into his own mouth. "Vomit! Now!" he ordered, his voice shaking with fear. Yu-tin, unsure of what was happening but sensing the gravity of the situation, did as instructed. His stomach twisted, and when he finally vomited, the contents were not what he expected. It wasn't food. It wasn't anything human at all. The pile was made of pieces, lizards, frogs, chameleons, all things that seemed unnatural, things that didn't belong in his stomach. The horseman, horrified, turned his horse around and, without a word, urged Yu-tin to climb onto the back. They rode in silence back to Yu-tin's village, the air thick with the unsaid. When they reached the outskirts of the village, the horseman finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You were there, in the village of the mimic. They say it's a place where spirits can make you live a dream, a fake dream, full of joy and warmth. But when you wake up, it's already too late. They have taken something from you, your soul, your spirit." The horseman shuddered. "That's why you threw up. You were full of their poison. That's why you need to forget about it. Don't speak of it again." Yu-tin never spoke of it again. Not to anyone. Not even to his family. But sometimes when he sat quietly on the porch in the evenings, when the sun was low and the air was cool, I would catch a far-off look in his eyes, as though he were somewhere else, somewhere that I would never be able to follow. That village, the mimic's village, had been more than just a mirage. It was something beyond the reach of ordinary men, something that would never allow him to truly forget. And sometimes, when the air is still and the world is quiet, I wonder if there are other villages out there, waiting for the next traveler to wander too close, to be drawn in by the laughter and the light, before everything fades away into nothing. The Crooked Legs. The girls' dormitory at Inlay boarding school sat at the edge of a dense forest, isolated from the rest of the town by tall iron gates and thick, twisting trees. The school was old, the walls adorned with cracked portraits of former headmistresses, their stern eyes following students wherever they went. The halls always felt a little too quiet, a little too still, but it was home for many girls who came from distant villages to study. Maya, a quiet girl from a small village near the mountains, had been attending Inlay for nearly a year. She was shy and often kept to herself, preferring the peace of her studies over the company of others. But there was something about the school, something in the air that made her feel uneasy at night. The girls who had been there longer warned her about the stories, whispers about the woman with crooked legs. It wasn't a story Maya had believed at first. Ghosts were for children, for the young ones who wanted to believe in the unreal. But as the nights grew darker, and the winds from the forest howled more fiercely, the stories seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The woman with crooked legs, they said, liked to haunt the restrooms at night, especially the ones in the girls' dormitory. It was said that she was a former student who had died many years ago, her legs twisted and mangled from some horrible accident. Some said she was struck by a carriage while walking home late one night, while others claimed she had been punished by the headmistress for a petty offense and left to die in the cold. No one knew for sure. What they did know was that she only appeared when the moon was full, and only in the quietest hours of the night, when the dormitory was silent and all the girls were supposed to be asleep. It was a Thursday night when Maya finally encountered the woman. The wind had been particularly loud that evening, rustling the trees like whispers in the dark. Maya had been studying late in the library, trying to finish an essay, when the urge to use the restroom became too strong to ignore. She hesitated. It was after midnight, and the corridors were pitch black. The restroom was at the far end of the dormitory, past the long hallway that always felt colder than the rest of the building. but she had no choice. Grabbing her flashlight, Maya pushed herself out of her chair and made her way down the hall. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the quiet, the darkness pressing in around her. She reached the door of the restroom and opened it slowly, the hinges creaking as if protesting her presence. The bathroom was empty, just as she had expected. She locked the door behind her, flicking on the light, the harsh brightness illuminating the cracked tiles and faded mirrors. As Maya went to the sink, she noticed a strange coldness in the air, even though the night was warm. She shivered, but chalked it up to nerves. She'd always been a little jumpy at night. She finished what she came to do and turned to leave, but something stopped her. It was a noise, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. Maya froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source of the sound, her eyes scanning the shadows near the door. And then she saw it. The woman was standing there in the corner of the restroom, her legs twisted grotesquely, bent at unnatural angles. Her feet were turned backward, the skin stretched tight over her bones, and she was moving slowly toward Maya, dragging herself along the floor with an eerie, grating sound. Her face was hidden beneath a dark, matted veil of hair, but Maya could see her mouth, a wide, slack grin that seemed too large for her face, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. Maya's blood ran cold as the woman's disfigured form lurched forward, dragging herself closer, inch by inch, the air thickening with a sense of dread. Maya couldn't breathe. She felt as if the ground beneath her had been swallowed up, leaving her suspended in terror. A voice, soft but sharp, echoed through her mind. Don't run in a straight line. It was one of the warnings the older girls had told her about the woman with crooked legs. They said she could catch anyone who tried to flee in a straight line. The woman would always be faster, always more relentless. Maya's instincts screamed at her to run, but she didn't know where. She didn't know if there was anywhere to run. The hallway seemed miles away, the door a lifetime away. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows around the room. The woman was closer now, her legs dragging behind her, a low, rasping breath escaping from her mouth. Maya's mind raced. She remembered what they'd said. Run in a zigzag pattern. The ghost couldn't keep up with anyone who ran like that. It was her weakness. Without thinking, Maya bolted for the door, but instead of running straight, she forced herself to zigzag, weaving between the bathroom stalls, the heels of her shoes slapping against the floor. The woman screeched behind her, an unnatural wail that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Maya reached the door and yanked it open, her heart pounding in her ears. She dashed into the hallway, her legs screaming for her to stop, but she kept running, left, right, left, again. The sound of scraping feet was growing fainter now, but she didn't dare stop to look. The only thing in her mind was escape. She ran down the dark, empty hall, her breath ragged. Her pulse throbbed in her throat, her legs burning with each step. When she reached her room, she slammed the door behind her and locked it, her hands trembling. For a long while she sat in the darkness, her breath slow and shallow, her eyes wide open. She didn't move. She didn't dare. The image of the woman with crooked legs was burned into her mind, her twisted, contorted body dragging itself toward her, that wide, too large grin forever etched in her memory. And then, in the silence of her room, as the clock ticked away the minutes, Maya realized something. The woman hadn't been alone. A second figure had been standing behind her in the restroom, someone she hadn't seen until she was halfway down the hall. The shadow of a young girl, pale and ghostly, dressed in a uniform she recognized all too well. Maya pulled the blanket over her head and closed her eyes, clutching her pillow so tightly it almost hurt. The room felt safe now, but she knew better than to trust the dark. The school might be quiet, but the night was never truly empty. And if you listened closely enough, you might hear her, still dragging herself down the hall, still waiting for the next girl to make the mistake of walking into her domain. Zigzag, always zigzag. Ma Feiwa. The village of Tayoki lay nestled between the hills of Cayenne State, where the land seemed to sigh under the weight of history. The fields stretched wide and endless, the air always thick with the scent of earth and water. But Tayoki had an unspoken darkness, a lingering presence that no one dared to discuss openly. Ma Fei Wa, the guardian spirit of the cemetery. Her legend had been whispered through the generations, passed on like an inherited curse. Every child in Tayoke knew that when the moon hung high and full and the night grew still and heavy, Ma Fei Wa would leave the cemetery behind, her haunting footsteps the only sound that disturbed the silence. It was said that she was a woman, once, long ago, a young girl whose life was cut short in a violent and senseless way. Now she was a spirit, cursed to walk the earth between the realms of the living and the dead. Every night she would rise from the graves, a casket perched on her broad, hunched shoulder. With her long, disheveled hair flowing like a river of shadow, she would shuffle through the darkened streets of Tayoki, her bare feet making no sound as they brushed the earth. When she arrived at a house, she would pause for a moment. Her hollow, unblinking eyes would scan the windows of the home, and then, with slow, deliberate care, she would place the coffin on the doorstep. The villagers knew what it meant. Someone in that family, usually a child, would soon fall ill and die. It was a curse that could not be avoided, a fate that no one could escape. And so, the parents of Tayoki learned to live in fear, always watching the shadows, always listening for the sound of Ma Fei Wa's shuffling steps. In the late 1990s, a monk named Sayadaw U Thanti, who had been living in a small monastery on the outskirts of Tayoki, began to have strange dreams. Every night, without fail, Ma Fei Wa would appear to him in a vision. She was not the fearsome figure he had heard of in the stories, but a solemn, hollow-eyed woman who stood before him with a quiet sadness. Her casket was always slung across her shoulder, and her long hair blew in the breeze like a storm. In the dreams, she spoke. "I hunger," she would whisper, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The flesh of children calls to me. The taste of their life is what I crave." The Sayadaw, deeply troubled by these nightly visits, sought the counsel of the Buddha. But Ma Fei Wa's voice lingered in his ears, growing more insistent each night. "I will come for them," she would say, "unless you tell me what to do. I will feast on their flesh, and the village will suffer." Sayadaw U Thanti was wise, his years of meditation and contemplation allowing him to see the deeper workings of the universe. He knew that the spirit of Ma Fei Wa was not one of pure malice, but one of sorrow, a soul lost between the realms, still seeking something she could not name. In one of these vivid dreams, he spoke to her. "Why do you haunt this village?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Ma Fei Wa, her hair whipping around her, lowered her eyes and sighed. "The hunger is unbearable. The taste of innocence is sweet, but no one will give it to me. I will take it if I must." The Sayadaw thought long and hard, and then, with a quiet compassion, he spoke the only solution he could think of. "You do not have to take the lives of children," he said. "There are other creatures whose flesh is more suited to your hunger." Ma Fei Wa looked up at him, her hollow eyes narrowing. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her voice cold and skeptical. "Dogs," the Sayadaw replied. "Their flesh is not bitter, but sweet, and their lives are not as precious as those of the children. If you must eat, then take from them. They will not be missed." There was a long silence, and for a moment, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Ma Fei Wa spoke again, her tone softer than before. "I will try. I will not take the children." With that, the dream ended. The village's warning. The following morning, after the monk awoke from his dream, word spread quickly throughout the village. The elders had long suspected that something had to be done to appease Ma Fei Wa, but none had dared to approach her directly. Now, with Sayadaw U Thanti's intervention, they were filled with a strange hope. They knew it would not be an easy task to change the spirit's nature, but they had been given a chance to protect their children. The villagers took the Sayadaw's advice to heart. The following day, the mothers and fathers of Tayoki began posting signs in front of their homes. Simple signs, but powerful in their intent. Baby's flesh is bitter, dog's flesh is sweet. It was a strange sight, these signs appearing in front of every home, even those far out on the edges of the village. Each sign was written in the local dialect, each one a plea to Ma Fei Wa, a silent prayer for mercy. The villagers hoped that their offering of dogs, sacrificed in place of their children, would satisfy the spirit's hunger. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. The dogs of Tayoke, many of them stray and wild, began to disappear. It was as if they had been drawn into the night by some invisible force. Sometimes they would return, bloodied and limp, their fur torn in places, but most often they did not return at all. The villagers grew anxious, but the children were spared. No child fell ill, no child died. Ma Fi Wa had kept her word. However, the sacrifice did not come without its price. The dogs had been taken, one by one, and the villagers knew the spirit would not stop until her hunger was fully sated. As the weeks went by, the once lively village began to empty of dogs. Some villagers even began to see Ma Fei Wa herself, moving through the streets at night, carrying her coffin as she shuffled past their homes. But the terrible, bone-chilling curse of death had lifted, and no child had fallen ill. There were rumors, though. Some said that in the dead of night, if you ventured too far from the safety of the village, you could still hear the soft shuffle of Ma Fi Wa's feet. And on particularly still nights, when the moon was full and the wind was right, you might hear her whispering in the dark, "The hunger is never truly gone." Years later, the village would continue to post signs, "Baby's flesh is bitter, dog's flesh is sweet," as if the warnings themselves were a ritual to ensure that Ma Fei Wa's hunger never returned. But no one ever spoke of her again. The memory of the woman with the casket, the one who carried death on her shoulders, faded into the shadows, only to be passed down as a tale to frighten the children. In Tayoke, the dead were buried in peace, the living in constant vigilance, and the dogs, ever so slowly, were no more. And Ma Fi Wa? She never fully left the village, but at least for now, the children were safe. The feces-eating witch or Chisar song. In the village of Thai, nestled at the edge of a dark, whispering forest, there lived a young woman named Nanda. Nanda had always been a dreamer. While others her age focused on learning practical skills, how to sew, cook, or care for animals, Nanda longed for something greater. Magic. The stories of powerful witches who could heal with a single touch or summon storms with a chant filled her imagination. She spent her nights studying old, tattered scrolls that spoke of ancient spells and rituals. But magic was a dangerous path. The elders often warned her, not everyone can bear the weight of it. Some fail, and those who fail, well, they become something else. Nanda was determined. She believed she had the strength to endure the test and earn her place among the village's wise women. And so, when the day came for her trial, she stepped forward without hesitation, ready to prove herself. The test was simple in its concept, but brutal in execution. She was to concoct a potion that could heal a mortal wound. The ingredients were rare, the timing precise. Nanda, full of confidence, began her work, but in her haste she miscalculated the ratios. The potion bubbled violently, the wrong color filling the cauldron. Before she could correct it, the elders stood silent, watching with sorrowful eyes. "You have failed, Nanda," one of them said softly. "You have not only failed the test, you have failed yourself." Nanda's heart sank, but she had no time for regret. The curse began almost immediately. Her body stiffened, her breath became shallow. She felt her head grow heavy, and before she could cry out, her neck snapped. Her head flew from her shoulders, her body standing motionless, groping the air as if searching for something it could not find. At first, Nanda could only feel confusion. She was still herself, still in her mind, still trapped inside the skin of the girl who had once dreamed of becoming a powerful witch. But now, she was something else entirely. A feces-eating witch. Her head floated through the night, its hollow eyes searching for the buffet she had been cursed to feast upon. The stench of excrement, the allure of rotting flesh pulled her toward the village outhouse. The dark hunger gnawed at her insides, yet she felt sickened by it, repulsed by the grotesque need to feed. But the curse could not be undone. For hours, her head fluttered like a grotesque lantern in the night sky, her internal organs trailing beneath her like a gruesome tail. She was drawn again and again to the smell, to the festering pile of waste and decay, unable to resist. The villagers knew what had happened. They had seen the signs. The day had passed, and Nanda had not returned to her home. The elders had seen the mistake, the slip in the test, and now they knew the darkness that had taken her. But there was hope. A witch hunter, a man named Tiha, had arrived in the village. He was a grim figure, known for his expertise in exorcising the feces-eating witch curse. He knew the only way to stop the horrors was to trap the floating head and prevent it from reconnecting with the body. Tiha waited at the village's edge, watching the shadowed path where Nanda's head would return. He carried a small vial of oil from the thayao tree, a rare substance known to bind spirits and curse-bearers. He had heard the whispers about Nanda, about her ambition, her drive, and he hoped that she would be the one to break the curse, even if she could not do it for herself. As the clock struck midnight, Nanda's head floated back toward the body, her eyes seeking that brief, fleeting moment of reunion. But Tiha was ready. He rushed forward, his hands swift and sure, pouring the oil over the body. He coated the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the place where the head would once again latch on. Nanda's head hovered above her body, pulling closer, closer, until, thunk, it tried to return. But the oil from the thayao tree worked. The head could not reattach. Nanda screamed, a strangled guttural sound that filled the night air. Her body twisted and jerked in a futile attempt to reconnect with her severed head. But it was no use. The curse had been undone. Tiha stood over her, silent, watching as Nanda's body fell to the ground, still and lifeless. "You will never feast again," he muttered, his voice low with both sympathy and resolve. The next morning, the villagers found Nanda's body in the clearing, the once hopeful young woman now lifeless and silent. Her head, no longer floating, had been claimed by the earth. The elders mourned the loss of what could have been, a girl with such potential, now lost to her own ambition. But the village was safe once more. The curse had been broken, and the name Nanda would be passed down as a cautionary tale, a warning for those who would seek magic without understanding its cost. The Fat, or corpse, possessing ghost. In the quiet village of Myothit, tucked away in the hills of central Myanmar, there was a small house at the edge of the rice fields. The house belonged to an elderly widow named Ma Ai, who lived alone except for her daughter-in-law, Tin Tin, who had come to care for her during her final years. Tin Tin was a kind woman, known for her gentle hands and patient heart. She had moved into the small cottage to look after her bedridden mother-in-law, who had grown frail with age and illness. Ma A had been suffering for many months, wasting away slowly. Her bones ached, and her mind had begun to fade into a fog. Tin Tin did everything she could, preparing meals, tending to her wounds, helping her drink the medicine that kept her comfortable, and staying up late at night to watch over her. Though Ma A often muttered of strange dreams, of shadows and voices calling from the dark, Tin Tin reassured her that it was nothing to worry about. "Just the fever, Ma," she would say, brushing the damp hair from Ma Ai's forehead. "You're not alone. I'm here." It was a long, drawn-out decline, one that took all of Tin Tin's strength and resolve. But finally, after one particularly cold night, Ma A passed away quietly in her sleep. Tin Tin wept bitterly, but there was no time to mourn properly. The villagers had to be told, the funeral preparations had to begin, and the body needed to be cleaned for the last rites. As the mourners gathered outside and the chants of monks echoed through the cool morning air, something strange occurred. A presence, faint but unmistakable, seemed to linger around the body. It was then that Tin Tin noticed it. Ma Ai's body, which had been still and lifeless only moments ago, seemed to twitch, a slight motion, like a shiver or a stir of breath. The hair on the back of Tin Tin's neck stood up, but she brushed it off as a trick of the light, the wind, or her own weary mind. When the monks came to collect the body, Tin Tin's grief was overwhelming. She could not bear to leave her mother-in-law's side even for a moment. It wasn't until the villagers returned to their homes that Tin Tin felt the weight of her exhaustion. The loss of Ma Ai, combined with the emotional strain of caring for her through her final days, left her drained. But there was no time to rest. She had to prepare for the long night ahead. As dusk fell and the stars began to appear, Tin Tin lit an oil lamp and made her way to the kitchen to prepare a modest meal. The hunger from the day's exertions gnawed at her, but something else gnawed at her too. A sense of something wrong. As she chopped vegetables, she heard a faint whisper from the bedroom. The voice was low, almost imperceptible, like the soft rustling of a leaf. Tin Tin. The voice called her name. It sounded like Ma Ai, her voice at least, but it was weaker, hoarser. Tin Tin froze. She had heard nothing else since Ma Ai's passing. The dead did not speak. She dropped the knife, her heart hammering in her chest, and slowly walked to the bedroom. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering oil lamp, but there, sitting up in bed, was Ma Ai. Tin Tin's breath caught in her throat. The body had been prepared for the funeral just hours ago. She had helped dress it. Yet here it was, looking much like it had before, with no sign of decay or rigor mortis. And those eyes, those same eyes that had always been clouded by age and illness, were now sharp and bright, glinting with something dark, something unnatural. Ma, Tin Tin whispered, taking a step forward. Ma Ai? But you're... Yes, my dear, came the voice, though it sounded almost too sweet, too knowing. I'm here, still with you. Ma Ai's hands reached out, her fingers grasping weakly in the air. Come, sit with me, I'm hungry. Tin Tin's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stayed, her legs unwilling to move. Something in her heart told her to trust, that it was her mother-in-law speaking to her, that maybe the spirit had not yet left this world. Of course, Ma Ai, she said softly, though her voice trembled. She approached the bedside and Ma Ai's hands gripped her wrists with surprising strength, pulling her closer. Sit with me, stay, Ma Ai repeated, her voice urgent now. I'm so hungry. Tin Tin's mind swirled. Hungry? What did she mean? She glanced at the bedside table where a bowl of soup had been placed earlier. Ma Ai had never had much of an appetite before. She could hardly hold down solid food. And yet now the hunger in her mother-in-law's voice was insistent, impossible to ignore. Ma Ai lifted her head slowly, her lips parted, and Tin Tin saw something wrong. A flash of sharp teeth, unnatural, predatory, glinting beneath the old woman's lips. Ma, what's happening? Tin Tin stammered, stepping back, her eyes widening. But it was too late. The old woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin, and with a sudden, terrible speed, Ma Ai lunged at her. Her mouth opened wide, revealing more teeth than any human should have. Meat! She growled, and the voice was no longer Ma Ai's. It was a thing wearing the dead woman's face. I need meat. Before Tin Tin could react, the creature sank its teeth into her neck. The shock, the coldness of the teeth, the pressure of those jaws, it all happened in an instant. Tin Tin cried out, trying to pull away, but the thing holding her, her mother-in-law's body, was far stronger than it should have been. The room was spinning. Tin Tin could feel her blood flowing freely, her vision fading. And yet, through the haze of pain and fear, she realized with a sickening clarity what had happened. This was not Ma Ai. This was the Fote. The Fote was a malicious spirit, one that preyed on the good-hearted, on those who served the sick with love and devotion. When a patient died, the Fote would slip into the empty body, taking possession of it before anyone could notice. And the first act of this fiend was always to feed, to feast on the blood of those who had cared for it in life. Tin Tin's strength ebbed, but a small, desperate part of her fought on. She knew that if she didn't act fast, the Fote would drain her completely, consume her very life. In a final burst of energy, Tin Tin reached for the lamp on the bedside table. With shaking hands, she swung it violently at the creature's head. The glass shattered, and the flame ignited the curtains. The Fote shrieked, pulling back, its eyes burning with fury and hunger. But the fire spread quickly, and within moments, the room was filled with smoke. Tin Tin stumbled backward, coughing and choking, but she had enough time to grab her shawl and rush out of the house. As she fled into the night, the house behind her erupted in flames. The Fote's screams echoed through the smoke-filled air, a dreadful, inhuman sound as it perished in the fire. The next morning, the villagers found the charred remains of the house. There was no sign of Tin Tin. They assumed she had been caught in the fire, but some of them, those with the knowledge of the old ways, whispered that the Fote had taken her life and that Ma Ai's body had become the vessel of a terrible spirit. And so, the village of Myothet learned to be wary of the dead and the spirits that might slip into the bodies of the living, of the Fote, who feasted on those who cared too much, who gave too freely, until there was nothing left but blood and bones. The Monk Ghost. The night had fallen over the village of Kyun Quin, a small settlement tucked away in the hills near Mandalay. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the faint hum of cicadas. In the shadow of the ancient pagoda on the hill, the villagers whispered stories that had been passed down for generations. Tales of restless spirits and vengeful ghosts were common in these parts, but none was as feared as the spirit of Wuna, a monk whose soul had never found peace. Wuna had lived a quiet, devout life. He had spent most of his days at the monastery, chanting, meditating, and guiding the young novices. But in his final days, the peace that had defined him began to crumble. There were rumors that Wuna had become obsessed with material wealth. He had secretly taken a small fortune in gold from the monastery's offerings and hidden it away in the forest. The monks who had discovered the theft tried to confront him, but before they could, Wuna had passed away in the middle of the night, his body cold and stiff in his bed. The villagers, uneasy with the circumstances of his death, buried Wuna in the cemetery near the pagoda. The monks performed the rites for his passing, but something was amiss. The prayers they recited seemed to have no effect. Wuna's spirit lingered, unable to move on to the next life. At night, strange things began to happen. One evening, Kaya Min, a young farmer from the village, was making his way home after a long day of work in the rice fields. He had always heard the stories of Wuna's restless ghost, but had never thought much of them. Ghosts were just stories, after all. But as he passed the pagoda, he heard a voice, a soft, distant chant carried by the evening wind. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa, it murmured, the words flowing like a steady stream of water. Kaya Min froze. The chanting wasn't unfamiliar. It was the prayer the monks used to honor the Buddha. But the voice wasn't coming from the monastery. It was coming from the cemetery. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Kaya Min's heart raced. He had heard about this, about Wuna's ghost. They said that the spirit of the monk wandered the cemetery, endlessly repeating prayers, unable to pass on because of his attachment to this world. But why tonight? Why now? A chill ran down his spine as the chanting grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right behind him. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Kaya Min spun around, his eyes searching the darkness. At the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the stone walls, he saw a figure, tall, draped in the tattered robes of a monk, his face obscured by the shadow of the pagoda. The ghostly figure stood motionless, its arms raised in prayer. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Kaya Min's legs felt like they were made of stone. He couldn't move. The air around him grew heavier, thick with the scent of incense and the oppressive weight of attachment. He knew what was happening. Uwuna's spirit, bound to this world by his greed, was reaching out for him. And the chanting, it wasn't just a prayer, it was a summoning. A voice, soft but unmistakable, echoed through the night. You who trespass here will not be allowed to leave. Kyamin's breath caught in his throat. He knew the stories. He had heard the older villagers speak of Uwuna's restless spirit. The ghost of a Pali-speaking monk, a spirit so attached to the world that not even the Buddha's teachings could free it. It was said that the only way to escape its grasp was to run fast. But there was no guarantee. The figure moved toward him, its head slowly turning to face him. The eyes, those eyes, were hollow, black pits, filled with an insatiable hunger for the material world. Uwuna's ghost had never let go of the treasures he had hidden, and now he sought to claim the living. Kyamin's legs finally found their strength. With a shout, he turned and ran, not caring for where he was going, just desperate to escape the ghost's grasp. Run! Run in a straight line, or in a zigzag. He heard the old village healer's voice echo in his mind. She had warned him. If you meet the monk's ghost, you must run, but not in a straight line. Run in zigzags, because the spirit would try to follow your every move, and running in a straight line would only bring you closer to its reach. Kyamin didn't waste a second. He ran in zigzags, weaving between the tall grass and the ancient trees. The chant followed him, echoing through the night, becoming louder with each step. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. He could hear the sound of footsteps now. Behind him, the scraping of bare feet on the earth. The ghost was coming closer. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Kyamin's lungs burned. His heart raced as he twisted and turned, weaving through the village paths, past the darkened homes, his eyes wild with fear. Every instinct screamed at him to run faster, to find safety, but the voice of Uwuna was always just behind him, the chant growing louder, more insistent. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Finally, as Kyamin rounded a corner near the edge of the village, the chanting ceased. The footsteps stopped. Kyamin stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving as he looked over his shoulder. There was nothing there. The ghost was gone. His mind swam in confusion. Had he escaped? Had the spirit of Uwuna finally given up? Or had the monk simply grown bored with the chase? Kyamin didn't know, and he didn't want to know. All he knew was that the ghost was no longer following him. With a shaky breath, Kyamin hurried home, the chill of fear still gripping his bones. He would never speak of the incident to anyone, not even his family. The villagers already knew the stories of Uwuna, but none of them had seen it firsthand. He would not be the one to tell them what had happened. But he had learned a valuable lesson that night. Sometimes running was the only way to survive. And if a monk, too attached to this world to move on, comes after you in the dark, the best thing you can do is run like hell, in a zigzag. The Bamboo Mat. In the quiet village of Kalay, nestled in the green hills of Myanmar's Chin state, lived a young girl named Thiri. She was 12, full of energy and curiosity, with the kind of spirit that could brighten even the darkest days. Like most girls her age, Thiri spent her afternoons helping her mother with chores, studying, and of course, indulging in the innocent joys of childhood. Though, as with all curious minds, there were times when she sought out something more thrilling, something mysterious. One sweltering afternoon, when the sun hung high in the sky and the air shimmered with heat, Thiri's parents left for the market, leaving her alone in the house. It wasn't unusual. Thiri was used to being left alone for a few hours. She was a responsible girl, used to looking after the house, making sure the windows were shut tight against the afternoon sun, and feeding the chickens. But today, the emptiness of the house felt different. It was as though the silence itself was pressing against her ears. She sat in the middle of the living room, fanning herself with a piece of paper, her thoughts drifting. That's when she remembered an old game her grandmother had told her about, a game that girls in the village used to play when they were bored. It was a little unusual, but harmless enough, as her grandmother had always assured her. The game involved a bamboo mat, just a simple mat, nothing special, but in the right hands, it could be used to call spirits. Theory had always been fascinated by the supernatural stories her grandmother had whispered late at night, especially about the spirit of the bamboo mat. She had never tried it herself, of course. It was something that seemed too eerie, too dangerous for a girl her age. But today, as the sun beat down relentlessly outside, the idea seemed oddly tempting. "Just a little fun," she whispered to herself, feeling a thrill of excitement rush through her. She knew exactly where the bamboo mat was, tucked away in the corner of the kitchen. Her grandmother had kept it there, wrapped tightly and covered with a cloth. It was used for sleeping, but in the right hands, Theory had been told, it could be used to summon spirits. Spirits that could answer questions, give guidance, or perhaps, just perhaps, cause a little mischief. Theory stood up and pulled the mat from its resting place, unrolling it carefully on the floor. She smoothed it out, then walked to her room, rummaging through her clothes until she found an old blouse and a hatamane, the traditional wraparound skirt. It was too big for her, but it would work for the purpose. She dressed the bamboo mat, draping the blouse over the mat and wrapping the hatamane around its waist, tying it loosely with a piece of string. There, she thought, feeling a mischievous smile tug at her lips, a spirit-possessed bamboo mat, ready for action. Theory sat cross-legged in front of the mat and took a deep breath. Her grandmother's instructions echoed in her mind. Speak to the mat as if it were a person. Ask it questions and it will respond. But be careful. Spirits don't like to be teased. "All right, spirit of the mat," she said in a whisper, half embarrassed by the silliness of it all. "Where will I meet my future husband? Will he be handsome? Will he love me?" She shook the mat gently, a slight giggle escaping her lips. The mat wobbled, then fell over in the direction of the kitchen. Theory blinked, startled. It had moved on its own. No one had touched it. She leaned forward, studying it with wide eyes. Was it just a coincidence? Maybe the mat had fallen over because of the way she shook it. But Theory was already hooked, the excitement of the moment overtaking her rational thoughts. She took a deep breath, then, with newfound seriousness, asked again, "Where will I meet him? Will he have dark hair or light?" She shook the mat once more, and this time, the mat teetered, then fell toward the back door. Theory gasped. She hadn't expected that. The direction was peculiar. The back door led out to the forest, a dense and dark place that villagers rarely ventured into. They said strange things happened in the forest. Spirits, curses, forgotten things. Her heart began to race. The game was meant to be fun, but the direction of the mat's fall unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The mat hadn't just moved. It had moved with a purpose, as if it had been listening to her, answering her with an eerie certainty. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she asked one more question. The question, "Is there something dangerous in the forest?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Should I be afraid?" She shook the mat a third time. This time, the mat didn't just fall over, it spun. Theory's eyes widened in shock as the bamboo mat whirled on its own axis, as though possessed by some unseen force. The spinning continued for several long moments, faster and faster, until it abruptly stopped and collapsed, pointing directly toward the darkened forest behind the house. Her breath caught in her throat. The mat wasn't just playing along anymore. It was alive with some strange, unseen presence. Theory hesitated, her instincts telling her that she had gone too far, that she should have stopped playing the moment the mat first fell. But before she could react, a cold breeze blew through the open door, and with it, a whisper. A voice so faint it could have been the rustling of leaves, yet it seemed to come from the very mat itself. "Leave, before it is too late." The voice was soft, almost a sigh. but there was something chilling about it. Theory's heart pounded in her chest, and without thinking, she jumped to her feet. She quickly rolled up the mat, the weight of the chill pressing against her skin. She couldn't remember the last time she had been so frightened. Without a second thought, Theory rushed to the back door and slammed it shut, locking it tightly. The wind, the voice, the mat, it was all too much. She felt as though she had awoken something in the house, something that didn't belong. Her grandmother's words came back to her. "Be careful, spirits don't like to be teased." Theory swallowed hard, standing in the middle of her room, her heart still racing. The house seemed suddenly too quiet, too still. She had played a game, yes, but now it felt as though that game had taken on a life of its own. She had invited something into the house, something not human, something ancient, and it was listening. A few hours later, when Theory's parents returned, she didn't say a word. She pretended that nothing had happened, that the game had been innocent, harmless fun. But deep down, she knew better. She had touched something, asked too many questions, and in doing so, had unlocked something ancient, something that had no place in her home. That night, she lay awake in her bed, listening to the rustling of leaves outside the window, the wind howling in the distance, and in the silence, she could almost hear it again, the faint whisper, carried on the breeze. "Leave before it is too late." The spirit of the bamboo mat had been summoned, and it wasn't going anywhere. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey through Myanmar's scariest urban legends. If you enjoyed the stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. There's more to come, so stay tuned for our next video. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can. Good night.